And I worry about the status of and the nature of the conversation we're engaging in politically in the United States, particularly when I see the character and the restraint that is being exercised by leaders in Northern Ireland as they try to move the region forward. And I gotta say, it's inspiring, and I sure miss that.
That was the voice of Joe Kennedy III, former United States Congressman and U.S. Special Envoy to Northern Ireland. And I'm Martin Nutty.
And I'm John Lee. Welcome to our latest Global Irish Nation conversation here on Irish Stew. Available across the known podcast universe and now at Irish Central, our media partner, serving the 70 million strong global Irish nation with the latest on politics, current affairs, entertainment, history, business, travel, and now podcasting. All at irishcentral.com.
Joe Kennedy, welcome to the Irish Stew podcast.
It's a pleasure, gentlemen. Thanks so much for having me.
So we're going to start off here. You're probably about 7 or 8 months removed from your position as the Special Envoy to Northern Ireland. What are you missing?
Oh, goodness. I miss Ireland. I don't miss the red eyes, but I miss the people, obviously North and South. I miss the warmth of their greetings. I was back over in Northern Ireland just a couple of weeks ago, and it was lovely to be back. It was great. I never had a day off. I guess I had one day off my first weekend that I was there 3 years ago now. But other than that, I never had a chance to even walk around the city. So I took it and walked all over the city and got to actually absorb some parts of that experience there that I didn't have. As they say for Northern Ireland, it is a wee place, but there's challenges to that, but there's advantages to it too. You can get a lot of key people that have ambition and vision behind trying to build a better community for their neighbors in a room. And you can actually make a difference from just getting those folks in a room. I think Northern Ireland, particularly at the moment, has much to teach the world. I think Ireland has much to teach the world. The Republic of Ireland, obviously, the economy there and the economic development over the course of the past 25 years has perhaps inarguably led the world. And what they've been able to build in terms of the development and investment in their people, I think is a true testament to the people of Ireland, their sense of empathy, the fact that they're willing to take some of that economic benefit and invest it back in to continue their education, to nurture future generations. When I take that to Northern Ireland, obviously not as blessed with those resources at the moment, but given where Northern Ireland was 30 years ago in the midst of the Troubles, I challenge you to show me any other place in the world that went through the challenges that they went through. And 30 years later, show me a place that is better off today than Northern Ireland is. And I say that last piece. Politics in the United States at the moment is particularly brutal. And not that politics in Northern Ireland isn't challenging, and of course it is, right? Democracy, politics are always going to be hard. But there is a difference between contesting ideas and challenging ideas about a vision for the future and practicing essentially the politics of annihilation, the politics of grievance. And I worry about the status of and the nature of the conversation we're engaging in politically in the United States, particularly when I see the character and the restraint that is being exercised by leaders in Northern Ireland as they try to move the region forward. And I gotta say, it's inspiring, and I sure miss that.
Joe, a prominent Belfast community leader that we know, a frequent visitor to the U.S., he describes the divisions he sees in the U.S. as worse than he's experienced in Belfast, and he's experienced them all. From your time in Northern Ireland, and some of the things you've just said about the transformation, the work in progress that is going on there, what can Northern Ireland teach the U.S. about reconciliation, about making progress around shared goals?
Gosh, so much. And not just the U.S., but the world at this point. The history of Northern Ireland, the history of the island of Ireland going back 400 years is not actually on the whole unique. Parts of it are unique, certainly, but parts of it are not. But if you look back through at least the start of the Troubles and this question about how do we balance identity, Protestant versus Catholic, Irish versus British, nationalist or unionist, how do you balance that on top of a place that has such history? It is a small place, and that history is old. As in Derry a couple of weeks ago, you're walking on walls that are 400 years old that have seen a lot. So you can't outrun the history in Northern Ireland. But what is most powerful to me is having conversations with both Unionists and nationalists who were active in the Troubles, engaging a typical Irish understatement, active in the Troubles, but who talk about the life that they grew up in and how difficult and challenging and traumatic and the pain that they've endured and how that's hardened and how it's awfully hard to let go. But if you got a kid that you love, which every parent does, and you want the best for your child, which every parent does, and you don't want your child to have to endure what you went through, which any parent in that circumstance do that. And as multiple people have told me, they're not willing to forgive out of the sake of forgiveness, perhaps, but they are willing to forgive out of the chance that their children, their sons and daughters, don't have to endure that trauma again. And that sentiment is on both sides or any side of that divide. And so what I found so inspiring about my time in Northern Ireland is it challenging? Of course it is. Is it hard? Yeah. I can utter myriad statistics that will show you that Northern Ireland is underperforming or deprived or whatever else. I can also put those in context that will show you that it is an extraordinary place. And when you add that layer in of saying, this is what you had to endure, this is where you are, and you now have found a way, messy, challenging it might be, but to both preserve the value of identity. No one can tell a Protestant not to be Protestant, no one can tell a Catholic not to be Catholic, but build community in the hopes of a common future. You show me, John, a place in the world that is doing better than Northern Ireland at that right now. And I can't find one. And I think that is far more important than any statistics you will find about gross regional product or unemployment rate, which, by the way, is still the lowest in the entire UK, in Northern Ireland. But if you can get that foundation right, you can build an awful lot on top of it. You don't, and the rest of it doesn't matter. And Northern Ireland is showing the rest of the world how to do that. And that is an important and timely lesson.
It feels to me that, to some degree, the smallness of Northern Ireland and the largeness of the United States, the political experiences in both those regions are like two ships crossing in a night. In other words, America had its great trauma in the middle of the 19th century with the Civil War and managed to put itself back together. Northern Ireland, obviously, I'm guessing you had somebody started telling you about the plantation of Ulster in the 1600s. But Northern Ireland seems to be going forward. America seems to be going back. One seems to be constructing a series of relationships and ways to connect. And yet in America, it feels to me people almost can't talk to each other anymore. So would that be congruent with your thinking? And what's the fix?
Yeah, I mean, look, these are complicated places, right? And so it's hard to talk with too strong brushstrokes. I will say the Battle of Boyne got brought up more in Northern Ireland than I had heard, including my modern European history class from high school. Like that history, as I said, you can't outrun the past in Northern Ireland, right? So it's still brought up. And you still hear people talk about the cousins and the ancestors that fought, right? It's amazing. But the past matters, right? And people hold on to it. And it informs the present, informs identities today that are core to who you are. And I don't think anybody or any community, any nation can succeed at trying to tell people to sacrifice who you are for the better of a whole. These are constructs of people, by people, and those entities have to recognize people for who they are and all our faults and failures, right? I do think that our geographic size in the United States has not obviously absolved us from various traumas over the course of our existence, whether that happens to be from, as you point out, the Civil War, which is probably our most impactful one, but the Trail of Tears, the settlement of the American frontier, those are stories that Americans have also leveraged the power of narrative that tell, on the one hand, a very romanticized version of that history. On the other hand, there were people in those spaces when settlers got there, and they have a very different story about how the American West was settled. And I think part of that tension at the moment, obviously, was some of those stories. That version of history was told on one side and didn't accommodate other people's interpretations of it and their own truths to it. And history can have different truths. I do believe that. But ultimately, it also comes down to a choice, right? It's my lesson from Northern Ireland is that after all of that bloodshed, after all of that hardship, after all of those years, after all of that pain, people are still there. It's their home. They ain't leaving. No side annihilated the other. Right? there are still unionists and there are still nationalists in the same communities, and there still will be. What I think the First Minister and Deputy First Minister have done, and again, this is hard, right? But it's a choice. They chose to say, we don't have to solve some of the problems today. We don't have to settle whether Northern Ireland is forever going to be part of the United Kingdom or whether there's going to be a referendum to join and make United Ireland happen by the end of the week. These are two leaders that have a very different vision of what the future of Northern Ireland is. And Northern Ireland is big enough to accommodate both.
And I would think the present that they're both looking at is, as you referenced earlier, we want good education for our kids. We want effective hospital care. We want job opportunities. We want economic development. Those things pretty much they can agree on. And
which citizen of Northern Ireland doesn't want to be able to go to a doctor and get seen, right? Yeah. Everybody does. Not Catholic or Protestant. That's just like truth.
Yeah.
And I think one of the challenges that we see at the United States is at the moment is a discomfort in those alternative narratives, whether that's past or present, and saying the U.S. is moving into a politics of domination. Politics of domination and democracy do not coexist.
Mm-hmm.
You can't dominate in democracy. You can be comfortable in the messiness because that's actually, humanity is not supposed to be uniform, right, or homogenous. And can we be big enough to be able to say, doesn't mean that it's all cultural relativism, doesn't mean that there's all a million different truths to something. There are still facts. But as any married couple can tell you, there are facts and there are interpretations. And unless your marriage is different than mine, granted, I'm about to point out, I've never won one of those arguments. So maybe that's not the best example. But there has to be room to accommodate our humanity in these places. And Northern Ireland, after a very hard-earned lesson, I think, is doing a better job of trying to accommodate that while pushing towards a common future. And the United States, as you point out, that is now litigating its past, which is not a healthy place to be and is not a recipe for long-term success. It just isn't, right? Arguing about who Fort Bragg is now going to be named after, which Bragg, is not how the United States military should be focusing its efforts.
Joe, you served as the U.S. Special Envoy to Northern Ireland for 2 years, starting in 2022. Tell us what the job entails, how you interpreted the job, and maybe some of the challenges, some of the great opportunities, and some of the progress you saw along the way.
Very kind of you guys. Look, it was an extraordinary privilege to be able to serve the United States and people's Northern Ireland, and obviously President Biden in that position. We'll forever be grateful to him for giving me that opportunity. The position of envoy to Northern Ireland has had broad bipartisan support since Bill Clinton created the position, with obviously the most successful and best known envoy in Senator Mitchell. And each succeeding envoy has reshaped that position in large part, from my perspective, due to the success of our predecessors. What Senator Mitchell was able to do then informed his successor in Richard Haas and others, focusing on the demilitarization of paramilitaries, right, rather than having to focus on a peace process. And then that success has moved forward over time to now focus on economic development rather than necessarily having to focus on some of those hard-earned pieces. That being said, peace is something that has to be earned and re-earned every single day. That trust has to be nurtured and invested in. You can't close the door on it yet. I'm not sure you ever can. Because again, you cannot run the past in Northern Ireland, but you can rebuild or build to a better future. The opportunity there was to then step in on behalf of the United States government and President Biden and try to see where I could be of service. The good news is that the United States government enjoys I think on the whole here, right? Again, broad brushstrokes, but a reservoir of goodwill with the people of Northern Ireland because they appreciate what Senator Mitchell and President Clinton, but also successors, President Bush and others have done to continue to try to advance that process forward, such that on the whole, they like us and they appreciate the effort and the attention and the fact that I think everybody knows at this point that America is not going to solve their problems, but America is going to help provide resources, connections, et cetera, to help them solve their problems, consistent with the vision put forth by Northern Ireland. And that's what I tried to do. I think I can point to some of the short-term successes there. What I think is probably a more honest and more accurate assessment is to say, well, if you're talking about larger scale, longer term investment, like those decisions take time. And it will take time for some of those things to materialize. That being said, working with the people of Northern Ireland and the civil service, and then eventually, obviously, elected leaders after the government got reformed, try to promote their vision for Northern Ireland and try to get that on the radar screen of U.S. companies to try to make the case that there's a real investment thesis here? Yeah, I think we were. In my conversations with a number of them saying, does that mean we're going to make $1 billion investment in Northern Ireland tomorrow? No. Does it mean it's on the radar for us to consider for a factory or plant investment in the future? Yeah. And so we'll see. I also think providing an opportunity for the people of Northern Ireland to tell their story and the impact that they've had in America is a hugely undertold story and one that is important to share here. And so trying to exchange that in both directions, I think, is very important. We tried to do that as well.
So we talked a little bit earlier about tortured history, and I'd rather turn to a more positive history. You come from an extraordinary family. A lot of times the word dynasty is attached to the name Kennedy. Many members of your family have obviously served in high public office, the highest public office, which your granduncle JFK and your grandfather was Attorney General. The Kennedy family is pretty large, lots of children, lots of grandchildren. Not all you guys choose to engage in public service. Tell me about the pivot points where it begins to hit your radar. Yeah, this is something I want to do. You say you served 4 terms in Congress, but talk about public service. When did it start registering with you, or was it just like sucking the air in because of the family that was around you?
It's a good question. And look, I think to some extent we're creatures of our environment. I was very fortunate to grow up in a family that prioritized public service. And there's a lot of families around the world that do, plenty in Ireland, plenty in the U.S., plenty in Northern Ireland, and plenty of other places. And that public service obviously can take many different forms, right? Whether you're a school teacher or a member of our armed forces and armed services, or the families, elected official, otherwise, there's all sorts of ways to promote the strengthening of community and the bonds of community, which is what I think about public service. I happen to grow up in a family where the emphasis on trying to find a way to serve the public was a priority, and not necessarily through elected office. I could argue pretty strongly that the work of some of our cousins and the Shriver family, through Tim Shriver and his mom's founding of Special Olympics and Tim Shriver's stewardship of Special Olympics, his brother's stewardship of Best Buddies, the impact that those two organizations have had on people with developmental differences is going to be more than almost anybody, perhaps, but one of the most successful presidents or administrations in modern American history. What they have done for people with developmental differences worldwide, what Special Olympics has done, is nothing short of revolutionary. And, Timmy never had to win an election to do that work. He's done plenty of good without having to go through the grind of elected office. Whether it's my dad's work in founding Citizens Energy, where I'm now president of a nonprofit energy company, whether it's the work that my Aunt Rory does as a documentarian, trying to shine the spotlight through film on many issues involving social justice and our history and in our present and in our future. I do think that our family recognizes the fact that I've been very fortunate, right, because of the success of other family members. We also, I think, at least in my interpretation, hold our own family narrative and own family story very dear. And that was one of, like many other Irish American families back in the 1840s, a story of deprivation and starvation and immigration. And emigration to the United States, and once you got here, not exactly being greeted with a warm embrace and open arms, and a lot of determination and suffering and sacrifice that made and hardship along the way that turned into a perhaps uniquely American story. There were a lot of other families that went through what we went through, and by luck and fortune, I ended up in this one. But you realize that not everybody else was as lucky to enjoy that opportunity, and so if you can do something about it, you should. And I think we also grew up in a family where, like every family, parents have coworkers over, right? Your colleagues, they come over for dinner, they come over, whatever, just the way that any family does, right? They have their friends over, they have their colleagues over. My family did the same thing. The colleagues and friends of many of them happen to be high government officials. And when you're 14 and you care, you just cared if they were could catch a football or not, or if they were slow, in which case you want to run the other team playing catch. But you saw them, one, as people, not as these kind of highfalutin or somehow distant public officials. And it wasn't something that was so foreign. Oh gosh, you're meeting a U.S. senator. It was like, yeah, there's 4 of them across the street. Who cares? Not that they don't deserve respect, but just a person. And so it made it closer to you. It wasn't some foreign thing. It also meant that you didn't have a knee-jerk reaction to government, or I didn't anyway, because I knew people that were good people that were genuinely trying to solve problems that confront their community. And that's what government is, right? It's people sitting around the table trying to solve a problem that confronts a community. So it wasn't a distant thing. These weren't evil people hiding behind some faceless bureaucracy. It was like a guy at the other end of the table that was cutting his chicken the same way I was. And when he came from a family that could see the impact that public service could make and making a real difference in making the lives of a lot of people better. If you had that opportunity to do it, why wouldn't you take it? And elected office is one way to do that. There's others.
Joe, you mentioned other ways and the ways you can serve outside of the governmental realm. And it sounds like you're involved in a very interesting, more grassroots project in the Groundwork Project, where you are venturing into areas Democrats fear to tread. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, Groundwork Project is an organization that I started when I left office a couple of years ago, focused on trying to build up civic engagement and extract the communities and places that the left has withdrawn from or underinvested in over time. And on the one hand, folks focus on the political side of this. I would say the broader point is that there's people that have different political perspectives in every community across the country. And look, there's some sorting there. Berkeley, California, Cambridge, Massachusetts be more liberal, right? Rural Texas is more conservative. That's fine. Welcome to democracy. Like we should want that. Rural Texas has a right to set some structures there that are more reflective of the community and the nature of that community than Cambridge, Massachusetts is. That's also fine. Where we see this tension is when the perspective of folks in Texas, Cambridge is trying to impose their values on Texas, and when folks in Cambridge think the people of Texas are trying to impose their values on their home, right? It's how do you create this common set of norms that we can agree on without infringing on somebody else's liberty, which, by the way, that's at the core of the tension ever since our founding. The challenge is that when one side politically withdraws completely from those communities, it means the other side, right, whichever it is, in these places, conservative forces of power dominate, despite the fact that there's other people there that have a different outlook as to what their community actually needs. And if you don't have those organizations that are focused on, again, meeting needs of community, whether that's on issues like voting rights or economic development or civil rights, women's rights, some environmental justice issues, then some of those issues don't get addressed because there might be conservative institutions there, but they're focused on what motivates them. They're focused on those, not on cleaning up the creek that was poisoned by a company that poured a bunch of arsenic into an aquifer, right? That's not their thing, so they're not going to deal with it. But then if there's nobody there to deal with it, nobody deals with it. So we're trying to make those investments in those local communities and community organizers that bring people together to actually engage in that process to help address those issues that otherwise aren't going to get spoken to. And that's not specifically saying, hey, we're going to go vote Democrat. That's saying, hey, there's issues here in our community that are not being addressed by the structures that are there. And we are going to invest in them and invest in those people such that in the Mississippi Delta, there's a Mississippi Workers Center that is run by an extraordinary woman that is organizing catfish factory workers and poultry factory workers. Because without her and without that organization, there's literally nobody else there looking out for the safety and well-being of those workers in these massive manufacturing plants and processing plants. That's not a Democrat or Republican issue. That's a workplace safety issue. That's an organizing issue. That's making sure people got to actually get their paychecks and fair wages, and they're not subject to harassment, and they can get bathroom breaks, and that the facilities meet actual standards. Because if there aren't people there to raise those issues and somebody can get fired and replaced right away and the wages are already low, then, as we know, workers don't have that power. They can be replaced immediately. The status of that work and their well-being degrades. So you need to create those systems to create that accountability for those employers and those structures. So that's what we're trying to do. It's hard work. It's long work. It can be exhausting work. We're supporting the folks on the front lines of those organizations in 4 different states and larger regions across the country, the Plains, the Deep South, and Appalachia. And we got a lot of work to do. But at the core of this is, guys, where we started. It's just there are people across this country whose needs aren't being met. And those needs aren't particularly extravagant or sophisticated. It's, I want to go to a place, I need to be able to earn a living wage. I have a right to go to a workplace that is safe. My kids should go to a good school. I should be able to access healthcare. And I should be able to provide a better future for my children. And if we can do that, then great. There's parts of our country where we can't. And we're trying to change that.
I'm just thinking about the Democratic Party right now following last year's election of President Donald Trump to office. There's a lot of stuff in the media saying the Democrats have lost their way, they're not being effective in countering. I know anytime I visit family in Ireland, I'm called upon to explain the whys of Donald Trump's election. So let me ask you this question. Explain to Irish people the electoral success of Donald Trump.
Look, I think some of that is explainable, some of that isn't, right? But I think the cardinal rule of politics always has been and always will be, from my perspective, you meet people where they are. And I do think that the 2024 election will be looked back on as one of these paradigm-shifting elections. 2008, Barack Obama, impact of social media and Facebook. 1960 election, impact of television versus radio, Kennedy, Nixon. The impact of what Donald Trump did, he and his team deserve credit for this, whether it was intentional or what they found it, but like they did it. Understanding that during a COVID crisis, society in America told people to go home and stay in their houses and not talk to anybody. And essentially, folks went online and they went down a rabbit hole and they never came out. And they're looking to find, we're social animals, you're looking to find community someplace, and they found community on podcasts. And so they went on podcasts. And it's not to say that like podcasts changed everything, but those podcasts enabled a message put forward by President Trump, former President Trump at that time, to get in front of enough people in enough places that matter to tilt an election a different way than the one that I was hoping for. They deserve credit for that and delivering that message to where people were. It is also true that I think in the 11 democracies in 2024 that hosted elections, 10 out of the 11 incumbents lost. So part of this was also, I don't think you can divorce the challenge of the fact that governance has gotten more challenging in democracies at the moment. That's on the one hand true. It's also neither here nor there. Donald Trump won. The question now starts to become, can Donald Trump deliver on what he has now promised to his voters? And I would argue, no, I don't think he can. And I don't think he can for very long. I happen to agree with President Obama's assessment of determining whether somebody's a good president or not. At its kind of most basic, did you leave the country better off than when you started? And I think the answer for Donald Trump is going to be emphatically no. What Donald Trump is doing is essentially what he did in the first term. It is all short-term gain for long-term pain, but he's not going to be around for the long-term pain. A bill that adds $3.4 trillion to our debt, which means our kids are going to be borrowing tomorrow to pay for their parents' tax cut today, which is one of the dumbest pieces of policy I think you can come up with. Betting on fossil fuels rather than clean energy. Thinking that you can somehow, rather than investing in people and talent to win an AI race, that you're going to be able to somehow cordon China off and through force of coercion and isolation, block them from succeeding. We need partnerships to do that. And there's lots of partners out there that want to partner with the United States. We're ridiculing them and trying to dominate them rather than investing in common challenges with them side by side. And what Donald Trump did, to give a succinct answer to your story, closer to your question, was he campaigned on a series of promises and narratives of saying, look, your way of life is not as strong as it used to be. And it's essentially an immigrant's fault. And if we clamp down on immigration and you elect me, then we'll make everything better. That is objectively untrue. But he provided an answer and a message to an audience that was sufficient to win an election. That also doesn't mean it's true. That means he won an election. For folks to say it's promises made, promises kept, the guy promised never to cut Medicaid repeatedly and just gutted it. And his acolytes in the House and Senate are saying it's always fraud and abuse. There's about to be 12 million people that get cut at least from Medicaid that the government's going to turn back around and say, you're waste. But he does.
Joe, maybe it was promises made to the donor class, promises kept.
It's promises. Who knows? He made a lot of promises to everybody, and he did. And that's one great thing about being a candidate is you can make promises to everybody. It's another harder thing in government that you got to deliver. And he's running into that challenge with these Epstein files of promising a base repeatedly that there's some big conspiracy in the heart of it. But now you're the president and you're not disclosing it. It either means you're part of the conspiracy or you're defending people that are. And he really wants everybody to stop talking about it. But if you spend 10 years promising people that there's a conspiracy there that only you can disclose and then you don't, like, what do you expect? He ran into a smaller problem on this before in his first term on repealing the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, repeal and replace. They couldn't replace it with anything. And then he failed because John McCain said, we're not just taking healthcare away from millions of people without a solution. Can't do that. They did this time. We'll see what happens. But it is the power of his message and the style of his communication is compelling. It's also not true. But it's not enough for a Democratic Party to say it's not true. You got to go out there and demonstrate it and be in community with folks and earn their respect back and earn their trust back and show you can do better. And Democratic Party's got a long way to go before that happens.
Joe, you gave the 2018 response to the State of the Union message, which for our Irish listeners, it's the opposition party gets a chance for 12, 15 minutes to respond to the State of the Union address the president just delivered to the Congress. And I was struck by, in a way, it sounded like the message would be so similar if you were tasked with that job today. Pretty similar message, although maybe your hair would be on fire.
I think it would be. I mean, the message back then was you had an administration that essentially ranked people by their worth, by their identity, by their followers on social media. That if you could get attention or that you were an important person or that you were a billionaire tech titan, then like you count, we want you front and center. If you're not, you don't really matter. And that is the most antithetical American message there is. And again, throughout our history, America hasn't always gotten that. But that was the promise, right? That we're all created equal, even if the we met there was not everybody. But like our task has been to make that we bigger and to make sure that we live up to that promise at some point. Donald Trump fundamentally has broken that compact with our people and saying some people count and some people don't. And in my version of those who count, it's the people who don't that are screwing you. And that's the reason why you're having these challenges. So therefore, we need to go after them because they're taking advantage of you. It's just not true. It is true that there's exploitation going on. I would argue it's a lot of, not everybody in that upper echelon class, but it's a lot of people in that upper echelon class that are extracting the value and the labor out of people that are actually built this country, make this country run, right? It's why they're struggling on immigration issues, because a big sector of our economy in America is built off of the exploitation of undocumented labor, whether that's in our fields, picking fruits and vegetables, whether it's in our restaurants for the servers and the busboys and the dishwashers, whether it's in a construction trade, folks building homes and a whole bunch of the service industry. You want to target them because they're here without proper documentation, fine. You're not going to be able to fill those jobs with Americans that actually want them. And do we have an immigration challenge in this country? Sure. Is there a way to solve it? Sure. By the way, remember this president distinctly and loudly blocked an immigration bill that had the votes from getting through Congress because he wanted it as an issue to run against Kamala Harris on, and he succeeded. One of the most cynical moves I've seen in government in a long time. But the message, essentially, John, everybody counts, right? That's what America's supposed to stand for. And we don't rank people. We don't rank them by pain. We don't rank them by worth. We don't rank them by height or weight or bank account. Because everybody counts.
Joe, John and I sit in New York. Obviously, you're up in Boston. Speaking of electoral politics, we have a big mayor's election coming up in November. I don't know to what degree you've been following that, but Democratic nominee Zoran Mandani won the Democratic nomination. And I was struck by your work in the Groundwork Project, outreach into, let's say, the reddest of red states. And what Mandani was doing as he was launching his campaign was going to find Trump voters to listen to their stories about why they voted the way that they voted. Is that a new way forward for a Democratic Party that some sees as hopelessly removed from working class concerns and hopelessly urban and hopelessly elite?
Look, if a new way forward for any political party means going out and talking to people, then you got a problem, like full stop. Society, our society, culture, communities in the United States are going through a number of very destabilizing trends, rural urban migration, the impact of technology, social media, AI, the concentration of wealth, in part driven by those tech companies, et cetera. But politics is still about people. And if you want to win votes, you got to go where people are. You got to listen to them. I often think about a Democratic Party has this challenge almost between the struggles with the distinction between diagnosing and treating, right? If you're a doctor, it's one thing to diagnose a patient. Say, listen, you got the flu, you got a fever, you got cough, sniffles, et cetera. You got the flu. It's another thing to convince somebody to take medicine to get better, right? And so if you have an ailment where there's a medicine that can make you better, most of us listen to a doctor because you have confidence in that doctor. That person is trained and certified and you've seen them before. There's a level of trust that's built up with them. They know, you trust that their education, they know better and they've got more experience. And so you're willing to take that medicine and get better. And over the years, as you get sick and get better by this doctor, then you build up trust with them and you heal again. That's treatment, right? It's somebody that has an expertise, but has built up trust with a patient community over a period of time that the sick patient will trust what the doctor is telling you to do and will then go do it. Diagnosis is, I can tell you what's wrong with you. And Democratic Party is very good at telling people what's wrong with them, telling communities what's wrong with them. There's not an investment in education. You haven't done this. You haven't done that. You need to get off fossil fuels. We need to do this. We need to increase the tax rate on wealthy people. Diagnosing is not necessarily all that hard. We've got plenty of smart people that can run a regression analysis and do some studies and come out with a white paper that tells you this is what we need to do. Building the trust to actually get communities to engage in the hard work of doing it is an entirely different thing. And that takes credibility, that takes trust, that takes engagement, that takes relationship. And we're very strong at doing that in those kind of highly urbanized, highly educated elite circles. We're less attuned to being able to do that in places that we don't know as well. And that in and of itself isn't so strange, right? Having a cowboy come into Cambridge, Massachusetts and talking to them about farm policy, you're going to have a bunch of folks that I have no idea what you're talking about. Not a surprise. But if you want to win in these places, like you got to have people that know them, that have credibility to them. And then, by the way, like when it comes to building the coalition, the folks from those major urban centers have to listen to the folks that are wearing cowboy hats. And if you're not, and you say, hey, you're wrong, it doesn't matter, we need to go harder or faster on X, fine. But if you lose that vote, you don't have the power to drive that coalition, which means you can't pass the policy you want. And that's not necessarily an argument to say be moderate per se. That's an argument to say in politics, you need to have the votes. And if you don't have the votes, you can't deliver the policy. And it's not enough these days, given the urgency that we face, from my perspective, to take comfort in shouting louder into the wind. If Donald Trump has shown us anything, it's there is an urgency for us to win, to rebuild, to heal, and to move forward. But you got to win first. So how do we do that?
Yeah, Joe, I think the social media is usually in the villain role right now with a lot of, when we think about the level of social discourse. But there are some upsides. There's a couple of farmers I've started following on TikTok, and I'm hearing what's going on in their world. And it's stuff I never knew before, things that I know are incredibly important as I sit down to dinner. But it's really fascinating to be able to access those kinds of stories in a way that wasn't available to us before. So there is a lot of upside. And are you seeing ways to tease that out a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, listen, the promise of social media is, one, you don't have these gatekeepers of media anymore that end up basically deciding who gets to be the messenger from a political cause or an issue of the day. And that's what used to happen when 20 years ago, it was when media was delivered by a handful of news organizations. You had to get booked, and you needed to know a producer and a booker, and they basically decided who was going to drive an issue and speak for this constituency, and everybody else couldn't. Now you can't, right? Anybody with a social media following can go talk to potentially millions of people anytime they want. There's enormous power in that. There's huge risk in that. How do you know it's true? Those farmers, I'm sure, are telling you a great story. Hopefully that's not some kid from Brooklyn avatar or making it up. And that's the risk and the downside is, and that's in the long run, the challenge that AI presents is that people just lose faith in everything they're seeing online anymore, because the sophistication of these fakes and such can recreate this conversation, right? Can change our words, can change our images, can replicate this broadcast in such a way that for an average viewer or listener would seem like it was accurate, even if it's something we never did or said. So if that's a real risk, where does that go? It brings me back to where we were a little while ago, guys. It's what do you, if you don't have faith in anything, where do you start to rebuild it? You rebuild it in your community, right? I don't know what's happening really far away. It's far away. I don't trust those sources of media. I can't put my arms around it. I can't touch it. I don't know anybody there, so I can't say for sure. But I do know what's going on back home. I know what's happening in my kids' schools. I know what's happening in my church. There's people here that also have relationships in other places that can tell me, and I trust them and I trust their sources. And so they can tell me, and I trust that. So how do you then rebuild, and the importance of that and rebuilding that trust in those institutions of trust, not big pearly white ivory tower institutions that will dictate national policy or national message, but that people and local communities can have faith in, that are accurate and well-intentioned and reflective of our community, that are then also part of a network, such that message can in fact be built. And then over time, people have more trust in that, and you can rebuild the foundation up from there. That's what we're going to need to do. And I obviously fear that it's going to get worse before it gets better, but no one said keeping democracy in a republic was going to be easy. In fact, I think they were pretty clear that it wasn't.
Joe, as we're heading towards the final stages here, could I take you back to Belfast? First, I wanted to share a couple of thoughts. I mentioned a community leader at the top of the show. The same community leader, I asked him, what was his take on your term of office over there as a special envoy? And I said, I think I can describe him as the most consequential envoy since George Mitchell. And he also said, it's very admirable how you remain engaged and helpful. I've never seen that in previous envoys. So he gives you 11 out of 10 for economic bridge building.
I'm glad you talked to my brother. Thanks very much.
And a brother in spirit, I think.
My brother wouldn't have been nearly so nice, but nevertheless.
You're right, exactly. I think it was a kind of an op-ed you wrote in the Belfast Telegraph, where you managed to get yourself up to the top of the Samson crane that dominates the skyline of Belfast. And you took some selfies up there, and the idea was coming back in however many years and seeing how much had changed. And how do you see coming back in 10 or 20 years? What do you see for Belfast?
John, that skyline's already changing, right? There's a big development of apartments that has gone up right next to, in front of the Titanic Museum, right next to the Normandy, the Nomadic, I think the ferry that was used to take folks out to the Titanic. There's a big development there that hadn't broken ground when I took that selfie. And I was struck when I was up there. You have this magnificent harbor, deep water port, a lot of heavy industry still around it, a number of vacant lots. That there's too much going on in Northern Ireland. It's got too much going for it to think that those lots are going to be empty in 10 years. And I'm sure they're going to start filling up far more quickly than that. Look, I think the world does not operate in a linear line. There's fits and starts to a lot of this. When push comes to shove, though, particularly for these global businesses, technology is going to keep making the world smaller. There might be barriers that get put up from time to time, but in whole, the world not going to get, technology is going to prevent the world in global economy from collapsing. People are going to be looking for places to build and invest in that are stable, where people are happy, where folks are well educated, where they're willing to build a good and reasonable quality of life such that they can raise families. And if you can get that foundation right, the investment's going to come, because the world's become so uncertain that where do you look to go? We want that stability. We want that foundation. We need skilled workforce. Northern Ireland hits all of those boxes. And I have an awful lot of confidence in its future. It might take a little bit, but we're seeing it. George Mitchell famously said that I think it was in one of his farewell address or shortly thereafter, that he looked forward to the time that he would come back to Northern Ireland and slip unnoticed into Stormont, which I don't think would ever happen, but slip unnoticed into Stormont and just listen to the debate of the day. And it would be about healthcare and spending and investment, transportation investment and such, just the kind of churn of daily mundane governance. Consequential, sure, but just what government's supposed to do. Because there would be peace and people would take that peace for granted. Hopefully, we're getting there. The debates at Stormont at the moment aren't over conflict. It's over what's going on with an AFAS and how do we think about an all-island energy economy? What do we do with data servers? And how do we make the investments in the port? Progress.
Speaking of looking forward to the future, you're as I said at the top of the podcast, 7 months or so removed from your role in Northern Ireland. What's your concentration going forward now that you're more firmly ensconced back at home?
It's nice to be ensconced at home. I miss Northern Ireland. I was over there quite a bit, so it's also nice to be back with kids and a young family. They miss Ireland, by the way. They loved it over there when we went out and take them. Priority at the moment for me is focus on this renewable energy company. We've got an enormous energy challenge and transition here to take place in the American electric grid, and I think there's a way we can contribute to that and help with folks that struggle to pay their energy bills, which is a lot of what we do. So there's a huge opportunities there. We'll continue to work on that. Groundwork project the need is not inconsequential there, and it'll take an awful lot of effort and hard work to try to continue to broadcast that message and raise the awareness to be able to get the investment that we need to try to make sure that everybody across this country does have a shot to live in a community that they enjoy, where there is agency and they can affect the outcomes and accountability so that they can be part of something. And so between a family and those two initiatives, I'm plenty busy and look forward to getting over to Northern Ireland as often as we'll have me.
So unfortunately, we're getting to that point in the podcast where we have to introduce our friend Seamus Plug into the room. So if there is something that you would like to plug, the floor is yours, Congressman.
Look, I will shamelessly plug two things. I'm going to take advantage of the opportunity here. One, the organizations in Northern Ireland that are doing the hard work to build that community and create that space, I think are doing the Lord's work, and hard and challenging, but so necessary. And obviously the Wave Center does that better than anybody, trying to make sure that that the challenges, those troubles are not forgotten, remembered, but done so centering those families. And that community work is critical, and not to equate these things, because what Wave does is extraordinary. But that same dedication to community is what we seek to try to emulate at Groundwork projects across the United States and in these communities, to make sure that there's local presence for folks to be able to have their needs advocated for, met, and seen. And so I think two good organizations trying to center those communities and do good work.
On behalf of John and myself and our listeners, I'd like to thank Joseph Kennedy III for taking time out of his busy day and telling us about his experience in Northern Ireland and his incisive view on matters political on this side of the Atlantic in America. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, guys.
Well, Martin, we covered a lot of territory with Joe in that episode, but I see it as something of an epilogue to our Lost in Belfast series. Joe shared insights of his time as U.S. Special Envoy to Northern Ireland, where he had his fingers on the pulse of business, politics, and the peace process in Belfast and beyond. And from people we spoke with in Belfast about Joe's time there, he was a highly impactful special envoy.
Yeah, we were asked on a number of occasions whether we had talked with Joe Kennedy or not. So it's a nice way to cap off our Belfast series with this conversation. And of course, in America, the Kennedy name, it's probably the most important political dynastic name in the ferment of American politics. So it's a pleasure to sit down with a member of the family, and particularly Joe, because he's so articulate on the issues of both Northern Ireland and American politics. And it was really interesting to consider how lessons learned in Northern Ireland could be carried over to our current American political situation. Finally, before we go, make sure you're signed up for our mailing list. Just head over to irishstewpodcast.com and you'll find a form on our homepage where you can input your email address so you don't miss out on any of our upcoming episodes. Until the next time, thanks again for listening. Irish Stew is produced by John Lee, Martin Nutty, and Bill Schultz. Editing, mixing, and mastering by Bill Schultz. Music on Irish Stew was composed and performed by Rosa Nutty, with Donald Bowens on drums, Cathal O'Riordan on bass and synthesizer. For more on Rosa Nutty's music, please visit rosanutty.com.